Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at the Black Book of Communism,
Mm-hmm.
which it's a pretty fascinating book.
Yes.
It's a pretty hefty analysis of communist regimes
Right.
throughout the 20th century. And even just glancing at the cover, stark black
Yeah.
with bold red lettering, screaming,
Mm-hmm.
crimes, terror, repression,
Yeah.
it's clear we're in for some pretty intense discussion. What's your initial reaction to that title, listener? Does it make you curious,
Yeah.
skeptical, a little apprehensive, maybe?
Well, it's certainly a title designed to provoke, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
But I think beyond that, beyond the sort of shock value, it raises a really immediate question for us, which is, are these crimes, this terror and repression, are these things inevitable outcomes of communist ideology itself?
Right.
And that's what this book really sets out to explore.
Yeah, and it's a question that has sparked intense debate since the book's publication. I mean, for sure.
For sure.
Because the book doesn't just chronicle events.
Right.
It lays out a very specific argument, right?
Exactly.
And it's that the very nature of communism, with its emphasis on achieving utopia
Right.
through revolution,
Mm-hmm.
and the dictatorship of the proletariat, it creates this breeding ground for totalitarian regimes.
It does. And to really understand that argument, you need to sort of delve into some of these core concepts that underpin communist ideology.
Right.
For example, the book dives deep into the idea of historical materialism,
Okay.
this belief that history is driven by class struggle,
Right.
which inevitably leads to the overthrow of capitalism
Okay.
and the establishment of a communist society.
So that's the theory. But then, how does this work out in practice?
Right.
Well, the book examines how this theory played out in various communist regimes around the world,
Right.
starting with, you have to, right? The birthplace of the first communist state,
Yeah,
the Soviet Union.
exactly. And it's in the Soviet Union, particularly under Lenin and Stalin,
Right.
that we see these initial cracks between communist ideals
Yeah.
and the very brutal realities of putting those into practice.
Right.
The book paints a very, very chilling picture of the methods that were employed to solidify control, like the infamous Gulag system.
Yeah.
This vast network of forced labor camps that swallowed millions of people, very often for the most trivial of offenses.
Yeah, and it's
Yeah.
hard to even fathom, isn't it? Like the book describes
Yeah.
how people were denounced by, neighbors, friends,
Okay.
even family members, feeding this atmosphere of constant suspicion and fear.
Yeah.
It makes you really question, how a system that promised equality and liberation could descend into such systematic repression.
Right. And that's the key point, isn't it? The book doesn't shy away from exploring that, this dissonance between this utopian vision
Right.
and the lived experiences of the people who lived under those regimes.
Right.
It forces us to confront the dark side of utopianism, this idea that striving for a perfect society
Uh-huh.
can sometimes justify horrific acts.
It's almost like that old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But in this case, the intentions weren't just good, right?
Right.
They were wrapped up in this grand ideology
Absolutely.
that promised to, remake the entire world.
Yeah, and that's where I think this book gets really, really interesting because it doesn't just chronicle the atrocities.
Right.
It actually tries to unpack the psychological mechanisms that allow people to accept or even participate in these systems of oppression.
Right.
Fear, of course, is a huge, huge part of this.
Sure.
But there's also this element of belief, of true faith in the ideology, which can be incredibly powerful,
Yeah.
even blinding.
And that raises kind of an uncomfortable question, right?
Yeah.
How can people, especially intellectuals and artists who are often seen as champions of freedom and critical thinking,
Right.
how can they fall prey to this kind of ideological seduction?
Well, it's a very complex question.
Yeah.
And it's one that the book grapples with throughout. For example, when we move on to Mao Zedong's China,
Right.
we see how this cult of personality, this fervent belief in the leader as an infallible guide,
Right.
this can further distort those original ideals of communism.
Yeah. The book talks about how Mao's Little Red Book
Right.
became almost like a sacred text,
Yes.
his words shaping the thoughts and actions of millions.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you have the Cultural Revolution,
Right.
this period of intense social upheaval
Yeah.
where anyone who was deemed a counter-revolutionary was targeted, persecuted,
Absolutely.
often publicly humiliated.
And what's striking about the Cultural Revolution is that the violence wasn't just top-down.
Right.
It was often carried out by ordinary citizens, fueled by this fervent belief in purging society
Right.
of anything that threatened this purity of the communist ideal.
It's almost like this dark undercurrent of human nature was unleashed, right?
Exactly,
This
yeah.
capacity for cruelty and fanaticism.
hmm
That just gets amplified when it's channeled through a powerful ideology like this.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most unsettling but crucial insights that emerges from this.
Hmm.
It forces us to acknowledge that this capacity for evil isn't confined to any specific ideologies or political systems.
Right.
It's a human potential
Yeah.
that can manifest in different ways throughout history.
And as we explore, more of the regimes that are documented in this book,
Yeah.
it becomes clear that this pattern of violence and repression wasn't limited to, the
Yeah.
Soviet Union or China.
Um,
From Cambodia's killing fields under the Khmer Rouge
right.
to, brutal dictatorships in Eastern Europe,
Exactly.
the book really paints this truly global picture
hmm
of the devastating consequences
Yeah.
of these communist regimes in the 20th century.
And I think what's particularly striking is how these regimes, despite their shared ideology,
Right.
often employed very, very different methods of control. Some relied much more heavily on state terror
Mhm.
and the secret police, while others, like Mao's China, utilized this mass mobilization
Right.
and ideological indoctrination to achieve very similar ends.
So it's not just about communism as this monolithic entity,
Right.
but about recognizing the nuances and variations
Yeah.
within all these different regimes,
Yeah.
how they adapted the ideology
Yeah,
to fit their specific context, their cultural
Yeah.
and historical circumstances.
exactly. And that's why I think it's important to move beyond just simplistic generalizations about communism
Right.
and delve into the specifics of each case. Because while the book makes a very strong argument that certain totalitarian tendencies are inherent to the ideology,
Okay.
it also acknowledges that the actual implementation of communist rule varied considerably,
Right.
depending on the leadership, the historical context,
hmm
and a whole host of other factors.
Which brings us to a crucial question. If these regimes differed so much in their methods and their levels of brutality, can we really say that the violence was solely the result of communist ideology itself? Or were there other forces at play, deeper historical currents, that contributed to these tragic outcomes we're discussing?
That's really where the debate gets very heated, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Because while the book presents this compelling case for these inherent dangers of communist ideology, it's also important to acknowledge the counterarguments, the voices that challenge this interpretation and offer alternative explanations.
Okay.
And that's what we'll be exploring in a lot more detail as we continue our deep dive into the Black Book of Communism.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it.
And one of the most common counterarguments you hear is that you can't just look at these communist regimes in isolation.
Right.
You have to consider the historical context. For example, many people argue that the violence of the Russian Revolution and the Stalinist purges that followed were really deeply rooted in Russia's history of authoritarianism and political repression.
Ah.
I mean, this predates communism by centuries.
So it's almost like saying that the seeds of tyranny were already there.
Yeah.
And communism was just, I don't know, like the fertilizer, so to speak.
Right, right. It wasn't just an ideological issue. It was this confluence of historical factors that kind of created the conditions for such brutality.
Interesting. Okay. And I guess similar arguments could be made about other communist regimes, right?
Absolutely. I mean, take China, for example. They have this very long history of dynastic rule and centralized power.
Yeah.
And you could argue that that might have predisposed them to a certain level of authoritarianism, regardless of what the specific ideology was.
Okay. But even if we acknowledge those historical factors, I mean, there's still this question of why so many communist regimes, despite their diverse contexts, why did they end up employing these similar tactics of repression? Is it something about, like, the pursuit of a utopian vision?
Yeah.
This belief that you're creating a perfect society?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make those in power just more willing to justify extreme measures?
That's the question that political philosophers have been debating for centuries, really.
Yeah.
Can any ideology, however well-intentioned, can it withstand the corrupting influence of power?
It's tough.
And is there something about utopianism in particular that just kind of lends itself to authoritarianism? The book seems to suggest that that might be the case.
Because if you believe that you have the blueprint for this perfect society,
Right.
then any opposition to that, any dissent can just be seen as this threat
Absolutely.
to that vision. So then it becomes easier to justify silencing those people,
Exactly.
the people who disagree,
Mhm.
because you're convinced that you're acting in the best interests of humanity,
Yeah.
even if it means resorting to these brutal methods. And that brings us to another really important aspect of this whole discussion, which is the role of ideology in justifying violence.
Mhm.
The book argues that communist ideology, with its emphasis on class struggle and the inevitable triumph of the proletariat, it provided this framework for legitimizing violence against those who were deemed enemies of the revolution.
Exactly. It's like the ideology itself becomes a weapon
Yeah.
used to dehumanize your opponents
Yeah.
and rationalize their elimination.
Right. It's a pattern we see throughout history, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, whether it's religious wars, ethnic cleansing, or political revolutions, ideology can be this really powerful tool. It can be used to unite people, but also to divide people. It can inspire acts of great compassion,
Mm-hmm.
but also horrific cruelty.
Yeah. And the Black Book of Communism, by focusing specifically on these crimes committed in the name of communism, it forces us to confront that darker side of that equation.
Right.
It challenges us to examine how an ideology that was supposedly all about equality and liberation, how could it be twisted to justify such widespread suffering?
And that's really where I think the book's title becomes so significant, right?
Yeah.
Crimes, terror, repression.
Mm-hmm.
Those three words are just this stark reminder that even the most noble ideals can be totally perverted
Yeah.
when they're pursued through violence and authoritarianism.
Exactly. And it's really important to note here that the book isn't saying that all communist regimes were equally brutal.
Okay,
There are distinctions made
right.
between different phases and different forms of communism. For example, it acknowledges that the repression that took place in Eastern Europe, while severe, it was generally less violent than what happened to the Soviet Union or China.
Which I guess suggests that there is room for some nuance
Absolutely.
and how we approach this topic, right? It's not about dismissing the suffering that occurred
Oh, yeah.
under any communist regime,
Yeah.
but it's about recognizing that there were definitely these degrees of repression and that they use different methods.
Exactly. It's crucial to move beyond those simplistic labels and generalizations. To really understand any historical period, we need to dig into the specifics of each case and look at all those unique political, social, and economic factors at play.
Because even within this broad category of communist regimes, there was such a wide spectrum of experiences, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, you go from the totalitarian nightmare of Stalin's Soviet Union
Right.
to, the more moderate, although still repressive regimes in Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And the book really highlights, this diversity of communism's manifestations throughout the 20th century.
And I think that's where the book's critics often miss the mark. They accuse it of painting everything with this very broad brush. Like all forms of communism are just inherently evil.
Right.
But the book actually goes to great lengths to differentiate between these regimes, to acknowledge the nuances and complexities of their historical trajectories.
It's not about condemning an entire ideology, right?
Yeah.
It's about examining the real-world consequences,
Exactly.
both positive and negative. And that requires a nuanced and critical approach
For sure.
that doesn't shy away from the dark chapters,
Yeah.
but also recognizes that history is rarely black and white.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most valuable aspects of the Black Book of Communism. It sparks a conversation. It sparks a debate that really forces us to grapple with these very uncomfortable questions
Right.
about power, about ideology,
Yeah.
and the human capacity for good and evil.
Yeah. And even though the book was published back in the late 90s, these questions are still so relevant today.
Oh, I don't
I mean, we're still grappling with the legacies of communism,
Yeah.
the rise of new authoritarian regimes,
Mm.
and the ongoing struggle for freedom and human rights around the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's so important to engage with books like The Black Book of Communism.
Mhm.
Even if they make us uncomfortable,
Yeah.
they force us to confront these darker aspects of human nature and to ask ourselves these difficult questions about the nature of power and the limits of ideology.
And one of those really difficult questions that the book delves into is, it looks at the economic consequences
Right.
of communist regimes.
Yes.
And it argues that the pursuit of economic equality
Right, which is a central tenet.
Right, which is a central tenet of communism. But this pursuit of economic equality often resulted in widespread poverty and stagnation.
Yeah. The book challenges this notion that communism, while perhaps morally admirable in its goals, that it's actually a viable economic system.
Hmm.
It points to the chronic shortages, the inefficiency, the lack of innovation that plagued so many of these communist economies.
It's almost a paradox, isn't it? Like, you're aiming for economic equality, but you end up with widespread poverty.
Yeah.
The book argues that this is because, centralized planning and state control.
Right.
They stifle individual initiative and creativity,
Yeah.
which are essential for economic growth.
Exactly. And this economic argument, it's often overlooked in a lot of the discussions about communism, which tend to focus more on the political and the social aspects.
Right.
But the book really points out that those economic realities have this really profound impact on people's lives,
Yeah, for sure.
and they can't be ignored.
It makes you think about how interconnected all these different aspects are, like the political, the social, and the economic. You can't really understand one without considering the others.
Exactly. And that's why the Black Book of Communism, despite its focus on the crimes and the repression, it also provides some really valuable insights into those broader historical, political, and economic contexts in which these regimes emerged and operated.
So, listener, as you delve deeper into the Black Book of Communism, I mean, keep in mind that it's just one piece of a very complex puzzle. Consider the author's perspective.
Right.
Read some other sources.
Yeah.
And just draw your own conclusions
Yeah.
about the history of communism and its lasting impact on the world.
And perhaps the most crucial question to ask yourself is this.
Yeah.
What can we learn from this history? How can we ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated in the future?
Those are heavy questions,
Yeah, they are.
but they're definitely worth pondering. Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to touch on something that really struck me as we were going through this book.
Okay.
And it's those personal stories that are kind of woven throughout the text.
Yes, those firsthand accounts are so incredibly powerful.
They really are.
They bring the human cost of these events into sharp focus.
There's one that I keep coming back to. It's the story of this woman who was imprisoned in a Soviet gulag
Wow.
for simply writing a poem that was critical of Stalin.
Oh my God.
And it wasn't even published. They just found it
Wow.
in her personal belongings.
Wow. It just shows how pervasive that fear and paranoia were.
Exactly. It was everywhere. And those personal stories, those glimpses into the lives of individuals who were caught in this machinery of repression, they really make this book resonate on a much deeper level.
They really do. They humanize those statistics.
Yes.
They remind us that behind all those numbers are real people
Right.
with hopes and dreams and families who suffered so much under these regimes.
And I think that's something that we absolutely cannot afford to forget.
Right.
It's easy to get caught up in, the ideological debates, the political arguments.
Yeah.
But ultimately, this is about human lives.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And those lives deserve to be remembered and honored.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's ultimately one of the most important goals of the Black Book of Communism,
Yeah.
to make sure that those victims of these regimes are never forgotten.
Yeah, it's those individual stories that really stick with you long after you put the book down. They really make the history come alive
They do.
in this really powerful way.
And they can also help us make connections between things that seem very different on the surface. For example, the book makes these comparisons between repression in communist regimes and the horrors of Nazi Germany,
Right.
which seems like a kind of a strange comparison.
It does at first glance, yeah.
Because communism and Nazism are often seen as polar opposites.
Right, yeah.
But the book's point is that despite their very different ideologies, both regimes had this totalitarian impulse at their core.
Okay.
This desire to control every single aspect of society and eliminate any kind of opposition.
So it's not about saying that they're the same.
No.
It's about saying that extreme ideologies, whether they're on the left or the right, can lead to these similar forms of tyranny.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that. And I think that's a really important takeaway from the Black Book of Communism. It's this idea that we need to look beyond the labels
Right.
and recognize these underlying patterns of behavior that can lead to tyranny. It doesn't matter if it's in the name of the proletariat or the fatherland or whatever.
It's about being vigilant.
Yeah.
And recognizing those warning signs early on.
Absolutely.
Because history has shown us time and again, power corrupts. And even the most well-intentioned people and movements can fall prey to that.
Absolutely. And that's why studying history, even those really dark chapters, I think is so important.
Yeah.
Gives us this more nuanced understanding of human nature,
Right.
of all these complex factors that can lead to both great progress, but also these
Yeah.
unspeakable horrors.
Because it's really easy to think, oh, well, we've learned from the past. We would never do that again.
Right, yeah.
Our generation is much more enlightened.
Right.
But the Black Book of Communism is a pretty stark reminder that that potential for tyranny, it exists everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
It exists in every society. It exists within every human heart.
And that's why it's so important to be critical thinkers, to question the people in power
Mm-hmm.
and challenge these ideologies that claim to have all the answers.
Yeah.
Because the fight for freedom and justice, it's never really over.
It's an ongoing thing.
It is. It requires us to be vigilant and to be willing to speak truth to power, even when that's uncomfortable,
Yeah.
even when it makes us unpopular.
And speaking of uncomfortable, I think it's worth pointing out that this is a very difficult book to read.
It is, yeah.
It's not something you can just kind of breeze through.
Yeah.
It really demands your attention and your emotional engagement.
Absolutely. And it sparked a lot of debate and controversy over the years,
Understandably so, yeah.
given just how sensitive and complex this topic is.
But I think it's so important to engage with these really difficult conversations,
Mm-hmm.
even if it challenges our assumptions or makes us feel uncomfortable.
Right.
Because if we don't confront these dark chapters of our past,
Yeah.
we risk repeating them. And this is especially relevant now
Mm-hmm.
when we see this rise of authoritarianism again
Yeah.
and this political polarization in so many different parts of the world.
Absolutely. The lessons of the Black Book of Communism, they aren't just about the past. They're about understanding these dynamics of power and ideology
Mm-hmm.
and how that potential for good and evil is still with us.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Black Book of Communism today,
Yeah.
we want to leave you with this final thought. How can we use what we've learned from the past to better navigate the challenges we're facing in the present? The political ideologies, the power structures, all of that.
Absolutely.
It's a question that really deserves our careful consideration. And I think it's worth remembering that trying to find these answers, it might just shape the future that we're creating.
I think that's a great point to end on.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us.
Mhm.
And we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.